Hello, and thank you for coming to my book launch for The Fresh and the Salt, the story of the Solway. I'm really sorry we can't all meet in person, but I hope that you just settle down, relaxed with a glass of wine, and you're happy to listen to me chat for a little bit, do a few readings, do a couple of nice videos, and there's even a song, but not by me, I'm glad to say. So first of all, of course, I would like to thank everybody at Berlin for bringing The Fresh and the Salt to fruition, to actual hardback copy out in the world. It's been a lovely experience working with them. And I'm especially grateful to Hugh Andrew, the managing director, for having the confidence that I've been manager, for gently steering me through the production and quietly persuading me to change some of my worst successes. And of course, to all the wonderful publicising and marketing and selling team. It's just been a really nice experience. Thank you so much. So then, where is the Solway Firth? Well, it's on the northwest coast of Britain. It's a finger of tidal water that pushes in between the south of Scotland and the northwest of England. If you think of Gretna is at the tip of it, and Carlisle is also at the tip, but just a little bit to the east. And this book then is about the origins of the Solway in geological terms, but also about how it's constantly changing, because that is very much a feature of the Solway, that its edges change all the time over the millennia as well as to the present day. And it's about how humans have intervened on the edges to change it, and we're talking from the Romans through industrial processes to tidal defences and future tidal processes, tidal power processes that might happen. It's also about the changes to the edges engineered by the non-humans, so the animals that live here, the plants that help form the salt marshes. It's about these animals and plants, what they do, how they adapt, how the incoming winter migrants, the fish, they also adapt, and how we learn to live with them and they hopefully learn to live with us. And throughout the writing, the research of the book and the subsequent writing, I've had such an interesting time, and I'm enormously privileged to have met and talked to, or listened to really, so many people who live along the margins, who have stories to tell, people who work on the Firth itself, trawlermen, ship's pilots, and along the edges there have been quarriers and stonemasons and sculptors, and just a huge number of people who really understand the Firth and how it works, and who've given some very interesting insights into it too, people like wildfowlers and peat cutters. I've also talked to scientists and artists, and they have helped me understand how mudflats and salt marshes form and how they perceive them as well. So there's been a tremendous amount to cover, and it's been a very interesting journey on my part. The chapters in the book relate to things like red sandstone and hematite, to ships and shipping and ship's pilots, to the salt marshes, as I've said, to mud flats, to what the Admiralty chart calls the changeable depths, how the seabed is always changing, which is a very difficult business for shipping and of course for wind farms. And there are a whole range of different topics. So I would like to start then with a reading to give you an idea of what the Solway Firth looks like from above. Several years ago, I took a gyroplane flight. These can fly low and slow, and they're actually rather terrifying thing to be inside. But it does mean you can have a good look at the margins, those changeable margins. So I'd wanted this different perspective on the Solway because it's not easy from shore level to appreciate the relationships between the bays and ports and rivers of the Firth's two coasts. Solway Firth is a crooked finger of water reaching far inland from the fist of the Irish Sea, apparently prizing Scotland away from England. There is an invisible border down the midline of the Firth, yet the sea also unites the two countries as a means of passage. The word Firth, or more commonly in Victorian times Frith, originates from a Norse word which also gives rise to fjord. and one definition is adamant that this differs from estuary. But at least 12 rivers, becks and burns flow into the Solway, and there's no question that the upper Solway is a major estuary, into which open many smaller estuarine mouths. Even at its innermost tip, where it touches the border at Gretna, the Firth experiences a tidal flow. Indeed, the Solway is famous for the range and speed of its tides, which during the bigger spring tides may have a range of 9 to 10 metres. In its entirety, the Firth stretches from the Mull of Galloway in Scotland across to St Bees Head in Cumbria. But for many people, including me, the Firth means the upper Solway, the land and sea to the east of a line between St Bees and the Mull of Ross west of Kirkcudbright. Zoom out to a much higher view than from a gyroplane to the stitched together satellite images on Google. There is Ireland's east coast and the Irish Sea, the Isle of Man, and the whole of the Solway Firth stretching inland to that porous border between the nations. Increase the magnification, slide the view to see the Solway in greater detail. There are the river channels, their beds braided by variations in their flow. The graded colours of sand and mud and marsh and the khaki channels of the rivers have been revealed by the ebbing tide. From both Scotland and England, the branches of wriggling creeks anastomose through salt marshes like the ducts in a kidney, and estuarine mudflats bleed water into their rivers. But these satellite views also show the glacial origins of the landscape, the brownish-red patches of the lowland raised bogs that grow upwards in wet glaciated hollows, the farmsteads built on drumlins above the flood-prone land, the relict glacial dumps of rocks, dark freckled patches along the shore. It is only 10,000 years, mere minutes on the clock face of geological time, since the glaciers melted and freed the land and the sea and the rivers to begin their dance. Around the malleable edges of the upper Solway, we're only scraping the surface of the deep time that lies below its seabed. I could stare at the satellite view for hours, dragging the image from west to east, from north to south, to find where I had walked, squelched, waded, slipped and scrambled along the shores on both sides of the Firth. Footfall words for exploring on the ground. Going back to the gyroplane again. We gained some height again, and now the view as we continue to head west along the length and width of the Solway is breathtakingly beautiful. Water glimmers in all directions in wide sweeps and layers of colour. Curving green channels, the alternating dark and light bands of underwater sand waves, golden brown banks of sand shouldering above the glitter. Sheets of light are stretched over the water and billow over mudflats. The estuarine mouths of the Nith and Locha water to the north are wide. When the tide returns, it will be no great distance to voyage from port to port or to the Irish Sea. We examine the edges further west along the English shore, the difficult entry to Sillothsport, the rocky scours and named moulders of the Allenby shore, the overgrown salt pans and foundations of the Roman mile fortlet across Canonby. But a grey curtain is being drawn across the south, obliterating the Lake District fells, obliterating the fields and woods, the outer Firth, the Scottish hills. The rain is driving north and east towards us. If we can't find a hole through it or fly around it, we'll have to turn back, for alarmingly, it seems that too much rain damages the rotor tips, and anyway, without a lid over us, we get very wet. The distant wall of rain looks solid and wide and low. We circle, hoping to find the edge of the cloud, but rain is spattering against the windshields. We retreat, heading back above the richly coloured peat bogs of the mosses towards Carlisle, re-entering bright light, warmth and colour. I'd like now to show you a video. This was taken at Port Carlisle on the Cumbrian side of the Upper Solway. I could equally well have chosen Maryport or Annan or Dumfries. These ports or former ports have many similar characteristics: red sandstone structures, shipping or former shipping, the problem of silting up. The Solway is a very, very silty estuary, and the influences of that mud and marsh on its wildlife. So I'd like you now to watch Port Carlisle Part 1.
Port Carlisle, and Port Carlisle is on the Cumbrian side of the Upper Solway. The reason it's called Port Carlisle is because actually there was a canal which went all the way from here, had a sea lock, and boats came in to the canal and travelled all the way up to Carlisle. It's quite extraordinary now. There's absolutely no trace of a canal anymore. It's all been filled in. It was turned into a railway, bizarrely. So there's a lot of man-made interventions to look at here, but there's a lot of lovely natural history that we'll look at as well. Over there is Scotland, and I'm here at low tide. It's just such a beautiful morning. There are egrets, there are herons, all kinds of waders. Anyway, I flew over Port Carlisle several years ago in a gyroplane, which was actually a rather terrifying experience. It's a bit like flying in a motorbike. There are no sides, and so you're leaning out to take pictures and trying not to wobble too much. And that's a picture I took then at low tide. So I'm sitting just about here with a salt marsh behind me, and there's the entrance to the lock to the old canal. Over here is the stone coaling wharf, and here, the very faint red line there, is the stone quay for the original harbour. And this lump in the middle that we see was actually a pile of stone put there specially to deflect the water as the tide came in and went out, so it would rush round in each direction and help scour out the dock. There's lots and lots of red sandstone around here, and that's something that is so typical of the Upper Solway. Everything is built of new red sandstone. We've also got a lot of wooden stumps here, which are the remains of a pier for paddle steamers. And so we have a lot of human intervention, but it was historical. It's not being used anymore. But the important thing about this area is the mud flats and the salt marshes and how it's always changing. The edges of the Solway are forever changing. Although it's not a very big salt marsh, as you can see, it still shows some of the characteristics. You've got the high up tier, and then there's a lower tier, and then down at the bottom you've got newly forming clumps of salt marsh, set up by grass like spartina, samphire sometimes, and as you move up you get up to the pink thrift, and higher up you get much less salt tolerant plants. There's a whole variety of wonderful plants that live here. It's a very interesting environment, it's very special. It also is very good at protecting the coast because it's cut into with all these creeks which sort of fractal pattern, and they dissipate the power of the waves as they come in, and they protect the coast a bit. But the salt marsh then leads down into the mud flat, and it's the mud flats I love. I mean, when you look at this you think, oh, nothing lives there, does it? It's just mud. But actually, let me show you something. Now look where the point of the trowel is. You can see lots of little holes at the top of little conical projections. Right, I'm going to dig the trowel in, and you can see on the trowel there are loads and loads of burrows, and some of them are actually U-shaped. And if I pull that apart, you can see there's very tiny wiggling things in there with some very long antennae. And these are mud shrimps, they're called carophium. And per square metre you might have 10,000 of these burrows. They are so extraordinary. They're wonderful little engineers. There's another one there. You can just see it wriggling around. They eat algae on the surface of particles. They stir up the oxygen in here. So wherever you've got burrows, you get a good oxygen content. Wherever you haven't got burrows, down at the bottom, it's quite black. Not much oxygen there. So they do a grand job in just engineering this mudflat and making it suitable for, not only for themselves in enormous numbers, but for other invertebrate animals. And here you've got the salt marsh and the mud flat, and I sort of think of them as being hand in hand in stabilising the edges of the Solway in a particular way. What I love about coming down to the shore at low tide is we see things that have been happening while we're not here. So you get a sort of snapshot of what's been happening earlier. Look at this, you can see here how the birds have been really busy. As soon as the tide's gone out, they've come scurrying in. These are perhaps knot or dunlin footprints. And you can see where they've been probing here. They've probably been going for ragworms or something like that.
So in that video, I showed you mud shrimps, which are small, exquisitely adapted organisms living in the mud along the edge. Well, mud anywhere in estuaries actually, but there are billions of them along the upper Solway shore. And as I say, they're exquisitely adapted to where they live. And when I show them to people, everybody gets quite entranced about them. Nobody really knows that they're there. And the names of their limbs, what they do, how they construct their burrows, which are silt-lined, are really intriguing. And a lot of people become quite hooked on the names of the limbs, like pleopods and gnathopods and pariapods. And so it is that there is now a song, the Song of the Mudshrimp. And this is thanks to Pentabus Theatre, who, in collaboration with Theatre by the Lake at Keswick, were going to put on a play called On One Side Lies the Sea at Keswick back in April, but of course that couldn't happen. And Pentabus Theatre, the group, had spent a lot of time up here on the Solway talking to people who lived and worked along the edges to find out more about their attitudes to living along this margin, if you like. Jenny Bell, who's a singer-songwriter, and I'd had a long chat about mudshrimps, as you do, and she became enamoured of the names too. And she composed this song. And so I'm tremendously grateful. This is the world premiere of the Song of the Mudshrimp. And thank you very much to Pentabus, Theatre by the Lake, to Jenny Bell, who sings it, to her bass accompanist, John Holmes, and to Ollie Lansdale for the photographs behind the song. So I really hope you enjoy this.
My name is Jenny Bell and I'm a songwriter. And I met Anne on a walk on the edge of the Solway Firth and asked her what she loves about mudshrimps. And one of the things she said was that every part of them has a name and she loves the music of those names. The Propodas, Ischium and Meras, Coxa and the Copper, and the basses, Maxilipido, Curovidae, crustaceans, not shrimps but amphipods, with swimming feet paleopods, walking feet pereopods, Europods, gnathopods, from the Greek for feet, the feet that eat.
Feet that eat.
Native to the Atlantic Ocean, their rapid motion, perfected over eons, is a skillful dance. Oh, those beautiful monsters, and all those who love them are blessed indeed.
They are blessed indeed.
Right, I hope you enjoyed that. I'd like to do another reading now. I found it very hard to know which readings to choose, actually, whether to take something that is very much concentrating on modern things that happen on the Firth, or another reading, or reading looking back a little bit. And I decided to go for salt marshes again, and because I especially love salt marshes, as you might have gathered. But this was a very intriguing day out with Peter Norman, who is the biodiversity officer for Dumfries and Galloway. And he'd got in touch because there was something really rather special he wanted to show me. Peter Norman and I park near Kirkconnell House, and we set off down a well-made track that runs parallel to Kirkconnell Merse, in a tunnel of trees which provide welcome shade for us and for dozens of fritillaries, their orange-brown wings flickering in and out of the shafts of sunlight. The largest tabanid fly I've ever seen, like an overgrown clegg, is resting on a stone, and I give it a wide berth to avoid disturbing such a huge, piercing, blood-sucking machine. The Merse is a gently swaying field of green, the seed heads of its grasses straw pale, and to reach it we must climb down through a bramble thicket and under barbed wire, then into and across a shallow trickle of water in a creek. Peter's been here before and knows we'll have to make diversions around several large creeks, for this is Old Merse, well established and dense with thigh-high grasses that spray clouds of pollen and speckled with the flat white heads of yarrow. It's Merse that's grown upwards, so that every creek is deep and slippery-sided, too big to jump across. 2 little egrets and I are hidden from each other. They see or hear me first, and unpanicked, unhurried, but very purposeful, they lift into the warm air, their wings dazzling in the sunshine. Necks stretched out, long black legs trailing, they fly towards the river. They've left nothing but footprints, slim, elegant, long-toed. Progress is slow as we look for easier routes, climb down into creek bottoms sticky with mud, climb out again. The temperature out on the Merse is a scarcely believable 30 degrees Celsius. This was in 2019, incidentally. It's hot, sweaty work and there are clegs. Gradually we reach the band of shorter saltmarsh vegetation, fleshy orach and the spikes of plantains, as well as scurvy grass, several asters already showing pale blue flowers, arrowgrass, and even larger patches of samphire. There are bare areas too, where the mud has cracked into a crazy paving of polygonal shapes with raised edges, or where the footsteps of a fox and waders have been baked like trace fossils. Sheep-like, we follow a yellowish line of a sheep trod, and eventually we come to the Merse edge. And although there's still the branching runnels of creeks to negotiate, the gravelly mud makes easier walking as we head south towards the river mouth. Now at last there is moving air and space to breathe. 6 bright white egrets fly ahead of us, and a pair of eider ducks are oohing softly out on the water. Swallows swoop, and a cormorant beats rapidly downriver. Peter and I step carefully down the sloping mud bank to look back at the Kirkconnell Merse. And from here the 3 layers are obvious, with different colours, different textures, the face of the nearest and lowest tier striated with sequential deposits by the tides. On my left there is a raised line of dark rocks, jumbled together along the river's edge. Between this wall and the Merse to my right is a wide muddy slope, smooth and glistening in the sun, where the mudshrimps live and where waders and gulls have left their busy footprints and probe marks. The barrier of stones on the left becomes higher and more defined. Although previously the rocks had been coated with mud and thin, flat fronds of green enteromorpha algae, these stones are black and sharp-edged, a type of local grey wacke rather than the granite I'd expected. And then we finally reach the iron rails of a narrow gauge track that runs along the top of the wall. In places, the rails are still attached to wooden sleepers. Elsewhere, they've been bent and jut upward like spars or hang across eroded hollows. A metal post sticks up on the seaward side, its rusty outer surface coated with barnacles. Yellow-brown fronds of Fucus serratus and channel rack, Helvetia, dangle over the track. Now, even at low tide, the Nith dominates. It ripples down towards us, a blue ribbon, blue and brown, edged on the far side by sloping mud that reaches back towards a narrow green strip of Merse. And on this side, the rails draw a line between the water and the mud and the Merse. We are all confined within this quiet river sculpture by the borders of distant trees. It's a wonderful and surprising place. So this was the training wall that Peter Norman took me to see, a wall that was built in the 19th century to train the river Nith and stop it spreading out so that the channel became deeper and wider and easier for ships to go up the river towards Dumfries. It is indeed an extraordinary place. And Walter Newell, who designed the training wall, he went on to design many of the important buildings in Dumfries, and indeed Dumfries Museum, as it is now, which holds the observatory, the camera obscura, and a wonderful big brass telescope, which people could use to spy on people reading in their rooms and on people on board ships down, heading out along the Nith out towards the Solway Firth. So let's have the second video now, Port Carlisle Part 2.
Just look at this gorgeous block of new red sandstone that's fallen off the wall there. You can just see its origins so beautifully. It's like a bunch of grapes, isn't it? And you've got hollows and lumps where the sediment has pressed down into mud and eventually become lithified and turned into rock. It's just a beautiful example of this sort of sandstone you get round here. You wander around a place like this and you come across all kinds of old artefacts that you don't really know what they are anymore. I mean, the bits of metal, beautifully shaped, granite bollards, all kinds of lovely things like that. And all around us, ruins of this, what was once a coaling wharf, where the ships used to tie up and unload their coal. When you look out at the upper Solway here, it's just horizontals. You see horizontal lines of water, horizontal lines of sand dunes, mud flats. Even the hills are fairly flat and the colours changing all the time. It's just a stunning place to be. And then you come across all this sandstone and granite and you think, where has that come from? Well, actually not terribly far away. There are a lot of red sandstone quarries on the Annan side, just across the Firth, and down on the West Cumbria side as well. And it's very likely that all this was actually brought up the Firth on barges and steamships later on. Now we look at the Firth and there's very little activity on its surface in terms of ships. But when this place was in its heyday, in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, it was seething with activity. I mean, there's one report of 11 seagoing vessels being up at the Carlisle basin at the other end of the canal. And down here there were paddle steamers almost daily between here and Liverpool and going across to Annan as well. There were packet boats taking mail and people and goods. There were the passage boats coming up and down the canal. Day trippers, it became really quite a thing to do. So it must have been such a busy place. And now it's very different. You can very much see how the natural environment is so important here. This has always changed for thousands of years. The sea has changed, its sea levels have gone up and down relative to the land. Any man-made intervention, for example, Lord Lonsdale built a pier over to the east there and it caused Port Carlisle to start silting up. There was a big outcry about it. The port itself was subject to silting. They built the Solway Junction railway viaduct and that caused changes in the flow of sediment. There's a lot of mud and sediment shifts around in this Firth. It's famous for it. And of course we tend to see things in terms of how it impacts on us. But actually, when I sit here and look out over these acres and acres of mud and sand dunes, it doesn't bother me because out there are billions upon billions of bacteria, microalgae, microscopic animals. There are worms, there are snails, there are crabs, there are mudshrimps, and they just take advantage of any change. If their habitat grows and expands, so they're happy. Their only worry is if it decreases and we cause interventions that cause bad changes and all this highly protected mudflat and salt marsh goes away, because that will then impact on the birds and the fish. So it's something we always have to think about. But meanwhile, I shall just sit here and enjoy the gentle sound of the birds and the sea and this absolutely stunning view.
And as I said in that video, this is something we've forgotten about, the busyness of the Solway, the busyness of all the major estuaries, really, with shipping in essentially from the 17th to 19th century. It's what Julian Hoffman calls the extinction of experience. I think we have forgotten how to use these tongues of estuarine water. We're used to using the oceans, but we no longer, apart from trawlers, some fishing boats, a few coastal tankers, we don't really use these inland waters, if you like, to such a great extent as we used to. And the Solway indeed is fairly quiet. In the final chapter of the book, Changing Times, I look at the past and how, particularly Morecambe Bay or Hudson Bay in the Second World War, and how we treat the past. I look at the present, visiting wildfowlers on the marshes and mercers of the Solway, hearing their points of view and looking at how in the present day social media has changed attitudes to wildfowling. And I also look at the future, the tidal power schemes which may indeed be built in the Solway. There are various proposals. And in doing this, it's a reminder that the Upper Solway has always been known as one of the least industrialised, least spoilt estuaries in Britain. And the Upper Solway is protected by many, many layers of conservation designations, all those acronyms that you struggle to understand, which are very important. So, but tidal power, of course, renewable energy is something that's very important. So, as with the views of wildfowlers, as with the views of peat cutters, I discovered, and so it is with our views of tidal power, there's no straightforward black or white point of view. And throughout the book, I've tried not to impose my own opinions and points of views on people as I've been talking to them, or as I've written about it. But here, perhaps in this final section of the final chapter, you might find a hint of what I think about the future. And I would like to thank particularly Simon Armitage for allowing me to use a very new poem he wrote when he instigated the Laurel Prize. And his thought child in that poem perhaps expresses rather well what I think about the future. But I will leave you to discover what that is. So thank you very much for coming along and for listening and for watching. Of course, you can find out more about the book on Berlin's website, but I also have my own website and that about the book, and that will come up at the end. So thank you again. And although I didn't meet you, it's been very nice talking to you. Thank you and goodbye.